Welcome, everyone. Thank you for your presence this afternoon. My name is Ivanna Yi, and I am an assistant professor of Korea Studies in the Asian Studies Department. I'm delighted to welcome you to the inaugural talk in the East Asia program's Korean Studies Speaker Series, organized by Professor Suyoung Son and myself. We would like to thank the East Asia program, especially Director Jeremy Wallace and Amala Lane for their support of this event. We would also like to thank our co-sponsors, the Department of Asian Studies and the Department of Comparative Literature. We are honored to welcome Professor Youngju Ryu, Associate Professor of Modern Korean Literature at the University of Michigan, to give her lecture today. Before I give further information about her work, I would like to begin with a land acknowledgement. Cornell University is located on the traditional homelands of the Kayokono, the Cayuga Nation. The Kayokono are members of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, an alliance of 6 sovereign nations with a historic and contemporary presence on this land. The Confederacy precedes the establishment of Cornell University, New York State, and the United States of America. We acknowledge the painful history of Kayokono dispossession and honor the ongoing connection of Kayokono people, past and present, to these lands and waters. I'll now turn to Professor Ryu's bio. Professor Youngju Ryu is Associate Professor of Modern Korean Literature in the Department of Asian Languages and Cultures at the University of Michigan. She is also the Director of the Nam Center for Korean Studies. She is a specialist in modern Korean literature with research interests in politics and aesthetics of protest, cultures of authoritarianism, and mediatized publics in modern Korea. Her wonderful first book, Writers of the Winter Republic, Literature and Resistance in Park Chung-hee's Korea, was published by the University of Hawaii Press and was selected as one of the best books of 2016 by Foreign Affairs and received the 2018 Association for Asian Studies James Pillay Book Prize. This book examined how Korean writers represented, organized, and performed anti-authoritarian resistance in the 1970s. Professor Ryu's interest in the authoritarian period in South Korea also resulted in an edited volume, Cultures of Yushin, South Korea in the 1970s, published by the University of Michigan Press in 2018. She is currently working on a book that re-examines the history of South Korea's democratization movement from the 1960s to the 2010s through the analytical lens of media. Following Professor Ryu's talk, we are fortunate to have as our discussant Dr. Shiqi Lin, a Klarman postdoctoral fellow in the Department of Asian Studies, who is working on the intersections of Chinese media cultures, Asian cultural criticism, media theory and ethnography, and political theory. After Dr. Lin shares her thoughts, we will have an open Q&A session. We warmly invite you to ask any questions you may have. If I could ask you to please silence your cell phones at this time. Without further ado, we are thrilled to welcome Professor Youngju Ryu.
So it's a real pleasure to be here. I'm honored to have been invited. And I want to start, of course, by thanking Dr. Yi, who has been the most hospitable of hosts that one can imagine. Dr. Son, it's great to finally be here, Cornell, where I think Korean Studies is really taking off. And Amala for making the visit possible. And Dr. Lin, who I gave less than 24 hours to comment on this paper, so I have to be really, really grateful for her graciousness. Before I start, let me also bring our attention to the fact that today is April 16th in South Korea, and April 16th, exactly 10 years ago, was the day the Sewol ferry sank en route from Incheon to Jeju Island and took with it 304 passengers, 250 of which were high school students on their class trip. I bring that to the forefront of our minds, not only to commemorate them and to remember them, but because there's much that still needs to be known that we don't know. And I think it's not unrelated to what I'm trying to do in this talk. Okay, so getting right into it. So several months ago, when I proposed the title of this talk to Dr. Yi, I did not know just how timely this topic would turn out to be. Those of you who are following Korean politics must know that last week, South Korea held parliamentary elections that delivered a historic victory to the incumbent president's opposition. A victory that all the news media, including foreign outlets like BBC, Reuters, and NPR, are calling a landslide. So let me start, if I may, though you might be wondering why a literary scholar such as myself is talking about this, with a rough sketch of what I see as the historical significance of the elections that we've just had. Right. So here's a little bit of an outline of what I hope will be some of your major takeaways. And I'll start with a rough sketch, as I said, of what I consider to be the historic nature of the elections that we just had in Korea. In last week's elections in South Korea, the Conservative People Power Party garnered 108 out of 300 seats, the lowest ever for a ruling party in Korean history. The opposition Democratic Party claimed 175 seats, but first after unencumbering its ranks of a large number of incumbents, the largest, in fact, in the party history, and 34.6% to be exact. The left-wing Rebuilding Korea Party, barely a month old, created a whirlwind and won 12 seats through the party list system alone, having declared itself an icebreaker, carving a path out of the frozen waters, which is now a metaphor for what the Korean society has become under the Yoon Suk-yeol regime. So together, the opposition managed to land 192 seats, 189 of which is considered progressive. And the Democratic Party will begin the next session of the parliament with a supermajority. So we are certainly justified in thinking of this election as a landslide victory for the opposition. But for all the discussion of the landslide, the actual number of votes that the Democratic Party garnered for its district level representation was approximately 14.7 million, or 50.5% of the total votes cast. As a referendum on Yoon Suk-yeol, whose presidency had been beset by one misstep after another, including last-minute gaffes that features green onions, of all things. Those of you who have been following Korean politics know exactly what I'm talking about. The midterm elections were projected to heavily favor the opposition, possibly even to the point of allowing them to get 200 seats. That number was significant because a 2/3 vote, which it would give, could lead to tremendous changes. It would allow the legislature to immobilize the executive vote, executive veto that President Yoon has been using liberally, adopt changes to the Constitution, and impeach the president. Rebuilding the Korea Party, for example, made this desire to terminate the Yoon administration explicit by adopting the campaign slogan, "The 3 years that are left of Yoon Suk-yeol's term is too long to wait." Vigorous polling a week before the election, as well as the projections of various network television exit polls on the day of, suggested that 200 seats for the opposition could very well become a reality. The exit polls, however, got 19 districts wrong, 18 of which went for conservatives, attesting to the significant phenomenon of shy conservatives that existed in this election. So the mood of celebration on the left has been diluted somewhat by a sense of disappointment
especially with respect to their performance in the traditional conservative strongholds of Gyeongnam and Busan, where they actually lost a seat rather than managing to flip 4 to 7 seats as in their favor as they have projected. I would argue, however, that focusing on the landslide creates an optical illusion that obfuscates the historic nature, and it is historic in my opinion, of the report card that South Korean democracy delivered, a report card on South Korea's democracy that last week's elections delivered. For me, the report contains 2 telling facts at the most fundamental level. First, that it represents the first time in Korean history that a progressive side, in Korean 진보 진영, has managed to gain the majority of votes in parliamentary elections. First time. And second, that the Green Justice Party, which in its various incarnations, 녹색 정의당 in Korean, had carried the left-wing banner since 2000, when its earlier incarnation, 민주노동당 or Democratic Labour Party, was formed, that this party has failed to gain any seats. The place in history that 녹색 정의당 or Green Justice Party had held as the only significant third party left of the Democratic Party has now been taken over by the Rebuilding Korea Party. The larger significance of these 2 facts combined is that South Korea may just have witnessed the beginning of the dying gasp of the so-called 87 체제, or the 1987 regime. The regime birthed by the storied June democratization of 1987, as well as its anticlimactic conclusion. New York Times put it this way at the time: as it turns out, quote, South Koreans had acquired through elections the same leader they would have inherited had there been no demonstrations or changes in the Constitution. Anticlimactic indeed. The renowned Korean sociologist Kim Se-ryun has analyzed the 1987 regime, 87 체제, as a passive revolution in Gramscian sense, with the absorption of the top tiers of the dissident coalition, 운동권, into the ruling bloc. Refusing to de-Cold War, which was one of the core imperatives driving the democratization movement in the 1980s, the 87 regime reinforced the division system by creating a short circuit between its preservation and conservative political and regional identity, as well as maintaining a system of elite privilege resistant to deepening and expanding of real democracy. The Korean ruling bloc has remained protean and nimble-footed enough to withstand challenges to its power in post-democratization Korea, surviving even the paroxysms brought on by the IMF crisis in 1997, 1998, and more recently, the blaze of 60 million candle flames, LED notwithstanding, that put an end to Park Geun-hye's efforts to rehabilitate her father's reputation and legacy in 2016, 2017. The despair felt by the participants of that revolution by candlelight was encapsulated in the frequently encountered phrase, and it went something like, all we've managed to change is the president. Everything else remains the same. Indeed, it is this despair that I think helped give rise to just the complete reversal that happened in the presidential election that delivered Yoon Suk-yeol, who has reversed course with a speed that has caught even Koreans, as familiar and habituated as they are with doing things fast, with time compression, with 빨리빨리 문화. Even they have been surprised by this sudden reversal. in mere 6 years since South Koreans taught the world how to do democracy, according to the Washington Post, Korea has devolved into a dictatorship by prosecutors, according to me. And I will go on record saying I am one of those people who think that. Doubtless, what I have just outlined about South Korean democracy will require multiple angles of analysis. And God knows I am not a political scientist. Nevertheless, I think the contribution I can offer is as a cultural critic and as a literary scholar trained to pay very, very close attention to the political power of language, which I think is an essential aspect. So let me start then this next section, President by Day, President by Night, and Media Canine, with an image, I think, that can help us situate exactly where we need to go. So here's a president, in fact, two presidents, a president by day and a president by night, posting to something that I wish I knew. President Park Chung-hee, the shorter of the two men, addressing Bang Il-young, the more portly of the two men. Bang Il-young was at this time the head of the Joseon-ilbo, the right-wing daily newspaper that today boasts the largest readership in Korea with 1.2 million copies printed daily. Joseon's market share in the year 2022 was 24% of the daily newspapers printed, according to Korea's Press Foundation. One imagines that it was at this gathering, or a gathering like this, that Park Chung-hee, President Park, came up with the famous nickname for his favorite drinking buddy. And he said, I may be the president by day, but you, my man, is the president by night. The comment was meant to underscore Bang's legendary ability to drink and womanize. More 기생, oh, they're updo, and updo is what you get when you formally become a female entertainer. So more 기생 owed Bang, their updo than any other man in Korea, is reminiscence that was featured in a collection of tributes that his acquaintances put together on Bang Il-young's 60th birthday. But it also alluded to the basic operation of the press, which must run all night to get the morning paper ready. In addition, I read President by Night as an extended metaphor for the political powers of the press. Press and its powers that are unelected, unofficial, and without term limit, as opposed to those wielded by President by Day, who must be elected, who must be official, whose term has to be limited. In that regard, we can ask, what does it mean that a head of the biggest newspaper is hailed as a president over all those things that must go on under the cover of night in order to keep a military dictator the president by day? And here, Shin Dong-ho, Bang's good friend, regaled him, presidents by day have come and gone, but there's only ever been one president by night, and that, sir, is you. So here's one possible answer to that question that Korea's 20th century history furnishes. The Joseon-ilbo in actually 1980, singing the panegyric to Jung Do-hwan, who just 3 months before this story ran, had seen it fit to send combat troops to massacre citizens in the city of Gwangju. The article hails him as a man who put the country before himself and the public good before self-interest. If you go to Joseon Archive today, you will find that the article actually does not exist. So the archive looks like the article appeared on page 3, and then the archive contains at least the version of the archive that I was able to access from the University of Michigan. Skips as deleted paper, page 3 entirely from the archive. I think they too know that it's no longer kosher to be saying this. Metaphor for journalism familiar to media scholars is that of a dog. The press should be a watchdog, guarding the public's right to know the truth. Indeed, the public good against the powers that be, the government, corporations, military, what have you. In Korea, the 1970s democratization movement gives us celebrated glimpses of journalists' heroic struggles against authoritarianism, such as this one. And throughout Park Chung-hee's rule, especially after the declaration of the Yushin Constitution in 1972, Park had a fiendishly difficult time controlling the journalists' collective pen. The image here is of a famous moment in 1974, when the journalists declared their resistance stance, affirming their essence as the watchdog for the public good. But Chun Doo-hwan, grabbing power by a military coup after the death of Park, knew very well of the war with the pen that his predecessor hadn't quite managed to win. From the start of his rule, he took a very big cudgel and wielded it against press freedoms. In the name of purification, over 1,000 journalists were dismissed, 172 periodicals were closed down, and 64 media entities were reduced overnight to 18 through merger and closures. All this in the very first year of Chun Doo-hwan's rule. Forced into submission by the master's cudgel, the media that served Chun were then fattened on the mealy bones that he provided. And Joseon is Exhibit A of that category, and it emerged as the #1 newspaper in the country by the end of Chun's rule, as its profits swelled from 16.1 billion in 1980 to 91.4 billion in 1987. The nickname "the President by Night" that had been given to Bang Il-young by Park Chung-hee was inherited by the subsequent heads of the Joseon Ilbo, as the control of the newspaper company passed from Bang Il-young to his younger brother Bang Woo-young, whom we'll see shortly, and from there to elder Bang Il-young's first son. But what happens to a lapdog when there is no longer a cudgel and bone-wielding master to serve and be rewarded by? By 1998, 5 years after the transition to civilian government, and the first year that the first progressive president in South Korean history, Kim Dae-jung, took power, the Joseon Ilbo was no longer a lapdog, but a more dangerous creature testing out the sharpness of its fangs on a fledgling administration, to see if the government can be forced to do its bidding and not the other way around. And if the paper had a very tense relationship with Kim Dae-jung, it had an out-and-out hostile relationship with Roh Moo-hyun, the president who took power after Kim Dae-jung, and here he is, long before he became president. I will save us the painful details of the drama that ultimately resulted in Roh's suicide. Suffice it to say, to the moment, that the earliest foreshadowing of what happens when an attack dog sinks its fangs into a target came even before Roh became president. Roh had just been named the spokesperson of the opposition Democratic Party here in 1991. having drawn attention for his outrage against Chunduan's goons during the televised Fifth Republic hearings. Here is how Role was framed by 조선일보 for its readership. In it, the newspaper cues its readers to remember just two things about Role: that he is only a high school grad, but somehow managed to become an attorney, and that he is wealthy enough to own a yacht. A classic literary strategy, this juxtaposition forces the readers themselves to furnish in their own minds the connection between the two neighboring terms. All the paper has done is just to provide the facts. Roh Moo-hyun did not attend Sky University. In fact, he is a high school grad. He was a high school grad. He was a lawyer, and he did own a yacht. But seeing these things together, the reader would probably say something like this to themselves: a mere high school grad, a luxurious yacht owner. What an upstart, and how gauche. Little did it matter that the luxurious yacht owned by an attorney lacking the proper Sky credentials actually looked like this. The paper has succeeded in creating a picture, a particularly odious one in the minds of its conservative readership, of an overeager autodidact, which was a term often used, levied against Roh Moo-hyun, and an upstart who aspires to a position that is not his birthright. And finally, in the post-democratization era, Joseon has presided as a proverbial kingmaker for conservative presidential hopefuls. In the election of 1992, when Kim Young-sam emerged victorious over his rival Kim Dae-jung through a mammoth three-party merger that isolated Kim Dae-jung's supporting region of Jeolla province, Joseon threw its support behind Kim Young-sam. And Kim reciprocated by visiting the Bang residence on the night of his victory to deliver his thanks in person. And here are two Kim Young-sam's photographed bowing his head to Bang Woo-young is Lee Myung-bak, who went through a very tough, bitter primary contest within his own party against the formidable opponent Park Geun-hye, Park Jung-hee's daughter, in 2007. Joseon's strong support behind Lee helped him win that race. And when he became the president, Lee reciprocated, paying back a debt of gratitude by allowing 4 conservative newspaper companies to be reborn as media group corporations through acquiring general programming cable TV station. And that's how Joseon, the newspaper 조선일보, gained a television station called TV Joseon, which has become a powerful outlet for the right. So recounting these decades-long history, the Korean media scholar Youngju Ryu has observed with some irony that those who managed to benefit the most from Korea's democratization in 1987 were the very presses that had tried to hinder the democracy most. And if you're very depressed about the story you just heard, I promise things will get a little bit better with a Maverick Newsman, Kim Jun, and his times. Into this environment, dominated by conservative media corporations, a Maverick Newsman entered in 1998, looking for what he called an alternative messaging system. And Kim Jun, in the years since, has been idolized by many as a mouse that dares to speak truth to power, and reviled by others as a partisan provocateur and rabble-rouser. And yet his role in transforming South Korea's media landscape over the last 3 decades is undeniable. The same media critic Youngju Ryu that I quoted in the last section has argued that what Kim Jun has done in galvanizing the South Korean left is not unlike what Rush Limbaugh's talk radio did for the far right in America. Medium is the message, is the famous mantra that Marshall McLuhan told us more than half a century ago. Kim Il-jun's reformulation of that mantra about the power of medium invokes a famous Zen teaching about the foolishness of looking at a finger pointing to the moon rather than the moon itself. And as you probably heard, look at the moon, and the person is looking at the finger. And how foolish is that? And here's how Kim Il-jun reframes it. But point at the moon with your male member, and people will look at your member and not at them. You get a feel, hopefully, about how his style, Kim Il-jun's style, from just that reformulation. Irreverent, iconoclastic, and unapologetically partisan, Kim is, to my mind, the defining figure of South Korea's post-broadcast age, which took off with the internet, exploded with the podcast, and achieved dominance with YouTube. In describing Kim as a Maverick Newsman, deliberately eschewing the term journalist, I am not suggesting that Kim fails to meet some objective bar for journalism adhered to by the more reputable legacy. If anything, the foregoing snippets from the annals of the Joseon Ilbo should cast doubt on any claim that the paper makes regarding the superiority of their own journalistic standards. But what I am seeking to draw attention to instead is the deliberate outsider position that Kim Il-jun has adopted throughout his career over the last 3 decades. From the founding of an internet newspaper to the launch of the wildly popular political podcast, Nakbongsu, to the establishment of a YouTube news channel that reached 1 million subscribers in the first 3 days of its livecast. And finally, to the founding of a survey and polling company that played an important role in the 2024 elections, parliamentary elections with which I opened this talk. All of these efforts, I would argue, proceeds from the insight that within the 1987 regime, the journalist establishment and legacy media is both an insider and a sustainer of the ruling bloc, a vested interest hindering rather than expanding direct democracy. Far from being an examination of a single figure, an exploration of Kim Il-jun, for that reason, in the context of his times, opens up a way of reading, of understanding what I'm calling whimsically here as the democracy-free zone, following like tax-free zone. Free of democracy, in other words. Democracy-free zone in the heart of South Korea's democracy after democratization, a phrase that I'm borrowing from the political scientist, Choi Jang-jin. So then let me move to the second half of my talk. Some of you might be like, what? She's only covered half. But material, I think, is going to be pretty entertaining, I hope. And I would like to examine 4 nodal moments that define Kim Il-jun and his times. And each moment is correlated with a particular innovation in communication technology. So the free within direction, internet bulletin versus print newspaper. In 1998, Kim Il-jun started his personal website. Though it neither contained regular news reports nor was updated daily, Kim gave the site the name Danji Ilbo. Daily. Ilbo means daily newspaper. Danji means to kind of get on someone's nerve or to be contrarian. So the Danji Ilbo has been translated as the daily tackle to some. Not unlike the Onion here in the US, the express purpose of Danji Ilbo, or the daily tackle, was to engage in, quote, high comedy, cynical parody, yellow journalism, and cyberspace gossip mongering. Kim Il-jun then took on the most senior columnist for the Joseon Ilbo, the most widely circulated daily newspaper then in print in Korea, and is still. And at this time, it was even more. Its influence was even greater because it printed over 2 million copies daily in a country of 46 million at the time. And this entire episode helped Danji's view count to swell to over 1 million just 2 months after its launch. And that bout, and I'm calling it a bout for a reason, went something like this. On Christmas Eve, let me first give you a little bit of the background of how this came about. So on Christmas Eve of 1997, as South Koreans were reeling from the Asian financial crisis, 조선일보 published an opinion piece with some choice words for Kim Dae-jung, the president-elect who would soon take office as the first progressive, but in actuality more like moderate left president in the country's history. The writer was this guy, and his name also happens to be Kim Dae-jung. So the Kim Dae-jung, the columnist, was offering advice to Kim Dae-jung, the president-elect. He warned his namesake that Americans were eyeing him with suspicion for his erstwhile leftist tendencies, and that in order to alleviate these doubts at a time of the worst economic crisis in Korean history, the IMF crisis, the president-elect should shed his leftist advisors, who can formulate no credible agenda, and instead adopt, as soon as possible, the financial reforms and labor flexibilization measures demanded by the International Monetary Fund. Kim Dae-jung, the columnist, supported his claim by citing a pair of articles from the Wall Street Journal. Enter Kim Il-jung. In a biting piece of satire that he called Public Announcement of a publication, Kim Dae-jung's new self-study guide for English grammar, Kim Il-jung, announced that the renowned columnist for the 조선일보 Kim Dae-chung of the Joseon Byeoruk had published a guide that readers seeking to improve their English must now absolutely consult. The guide was to be recommended particularly to those slackers among Danji's readers who had slept their way through their English classes in high school and thought that the word populist, one of the adjectives used to describe the South Korean president-elect in the Wall Street Journal article, meant seeking to appeal to ordinary people. After reading Kim Dae-chung's new self-study guide, they will know that populist actually means craving popularity. Even more important for mastery in English was knowing what to omit when translating English into Korean. Take, for example, another sentence appearing in the Wall Street Journal. Quote, concerns over Mr. Kim's economic policy, to be sure, may be unfounded. That was a sentence in the Wall Street Journal. The piece argued that the phrases concerns over and to be sure were utterly useless, since Kim Dae-chung dropped both in his translation, leaving the sentence as, Mr. Kim's economic policy may prove to be unfounded. So you go from concerns over Mr. Kim's economic policy, to be sure, may be unfounded, to Mr. Kim's economic policy may prove to be unfounded, which was what the column, Kim Dae-jung's column in 조선일보 had written in its particular exercise of politics of citational practice. In point of fact, so I'm kind of parroting Kim Il-jung here in the way that he made satire of that mistranslation. In point of fact, the phrase may prove to be was unnecessary as well. The sentence can thus be rendered as Mr. Kim's economic policy is unfounded. And that is precisely the conclusion that Kim Dae-chung draws in the Wall Street Journal. So, as a weapon, Kim Il-jung's satire was not a pistol but a machine gun, and it hit multiple targets in a single round. The column's channeling of the national panic over the Asian financial crisis into vague dread over leftist tendencies of the new president-elect that might offend our American friends. The president-elect was further guilty of the unconscionable crime of being from the wrong part of the country, since he hailed from the despised Southwest, not Southeast, as all of his four predecessors had done. Hewed a tried and true formula that had kept conservatives in power in Korea until recently. For years, Kim Dae-jung, the columnist, had been the chief mouthpiece of the Joseonilbo, the bastion vanguard of the right in South Korea, whose hegemonic position had been sustained without interruption through the holy trinity of developmentalism, patriarchalism, and pro-American anti-communism, with Southeastern regionalism making an occasional side appearance as what I might say, or what I might call the Virgin Mary. By renaming Kim Dae-jung as Kim Dae-chung, the satire drew attention to the columnist as a shoddy journalist, because Dae-chung in Korean means to do something very shoddy, sloppily. Whether on account of willful mistranslation or laziness, Kim Dae-chung had delivered a rough or approximate translation. Dae-chung can also mean large vermin in Sino-Korean. By naming the Joseonilbo as a Joseon Byeoruk, Kim Il-jung continued the entomological humor and added a layer of the sexual and scatological as well. Since Jo means cock, and Joseon means a cock stand, ergo erection, and Byeoruk equals flea, ergo the flea with an erection. The Joseon Byeoruk is literally a flea with an erection, a comical image that ridiculed a powerful newspaper company by degrading it through a big joke. The degradation had an even more specific valence of meaning, since since in the world of Korean print media, Byeoruk refers to Byeoruk Sijang, or the flea market. Consisting almost entirely of classified ads, Byeoruk Sijang occupies the bottommost rung in the hierarchy of Korean newsprint. By linking the Joseonilbo and Byeoruk Sijang together, Kim Il-jung succeeded in delegitimating Joseon's claims to independent journalism by presenting the newspaper as completely beholden to business interests. It was no better than the flea market. Kim Il-jung's tackle thus reduced Kim Dae-jung, only the most influential journalist of the year, for the 5th year running then, into the largest and the sloppiest of the vermin riding for the flea with an erection. The literary critic Suyoung Son has described this bout as a fabulous victory delivering shoulder throw. I am a petty cheat, Lee Myung-bak and Oh Se-hun, podcast versus politicians. The second moment I would like to discuss concerns a podcast called 나는 꼼수다 that ran from April 2011 to December 2012. Featured Kim Il-jung with 3 other men shooting the breeze on Korean current affairs and comparing notes on salacious stories of political intrigue that toe the line between investigative journalism and conspiracy theory. The podcast title, translated variously in American press as I'm a petty-minded creep, I'm a sneaky trickster, or I'm a weasel, was a play on the title of I'm a Singer, the most talked about television program of 2011, which featured Korean's top reporting artists in a singing competition. But contrary to how it was frequently interpreted in American coverage, the eponymous creep, trickster, or weasel was not self-referential. Substituting the word 가수 with 꼼수, 가수 is singer and 꼼수 is a cheap trick, the podcast paid homage to the fine art of chicanery perfected by none other than Lee Myung-bak, who was then the president of the country. The show's professed mission was to recognize, in both senses of the word, as perceiving and honoring, 꼼수, a cheap trick, as the essence of the president of the country, and to marvel at the creativity and discipline with which he managed to stay true to 꼼수, the essence of himself, every day. This formula proved explosively popular. 나꼼수's weekly updated episodes routinely logged 2 million downloads and 6 million hits. Kim Il-jung presided over it all, piecing the scenario together, translating the details of complicated stories into the colloquial, conversational language of every man, and infusing the whole proceeding with a loud laughter. A full-throated guffaw erupting from deep in the gut and ending in a wet gulp. Kim Il-jun's laughter, according to the literary critic Suyoung Son, had fangs. Essentially, what they managed to do was to take down the sitting mayor of Seoul and deride him mercilessly in the process. And I can talk more about how that happened, but I won't go into now because of time. And the dick joke returns. The mayor, he was nicknamed Little MB. He had presidential ambitions. Thought he was going to inherit Lee Myung-bak's mantle. And he resigned his mayoral seat and wanted to become the icon of conservatives. But icon, or 아이콘 in Korean, actually rhymes with 뽀까이콘, which is Korean version of Ujanomiel's bibu, and also a dick joke. So let me just end this part with read this one. Okay. So indeed, it was Kim Il-jun's facility to deploy language kinetically and to take maximum advantage of the inherent as well as historically informed plasticity of the Korean language that I think comprised one of the vital factors behind Nakumsu's wide success. Oh-se-hoon's fall from the sublime realm of duty to the material sphere of personal and self-gain was sprinkled with 고깔콘, these bugles, each tiny bugle a terrible imputation on his manhood that cut him down to size. Aided by Nakumsu, the manner of Oh-se-hoon's departure from public life was seen as so ignominious that it took Oh a full decade to rebuild his political career and return as a mayor of Seoul, which he did in 2021, following the suicide of Mayor Park Won-sun, and Oh remains currently the mayor of Seoul today. Okay, now on to YouTube. The next significant medium that Kim Il-jun innovated was YouTube, where he started a talk show specifically devoted to laying bare the criminality of Lee Myung-bak's financial dealings. One of which was his ownership, shadow ownership of the company called Das, and the bribery he received through that company. Kim called his weekly talk show Das Vader, which, you know, if you're a Korean speaker, is quite similar to Darth Vader, even though you might think that just listening hearing these two words together. Okay, and Kim's show kept this issue alive, this question, whose is Das? Whose is Das? Through his satire, and to make the long story short, Lee Myung-bak ended up going to jail. The courts declared, indeed, he was the owner, and not just the shadow owner of Das. And then these were some of the memes, the merciless repetition of this question led to the Korean public to create. Justin Turner was the MVP for the National League, and he was being interviewed. And the Korean netizens crafted this. Justin, I have a question for you. Who's this Das? Okay. And then the last part. Okay. In creating these alternative messaging systems over the years, and especially surrounding his success with the podcast Nakumsu, Kim Il-jun repeatedly invoked two figures, referring to himself in half jest and half derision as both a 잠놈 and a 무학의 지식인. A 잠놈 is a rogue, a bastard with no birthright. 무학의 지식인 is literally an intellectual, but one with no education. While completely opposite in meaning in and of themselves, both 잠놈 and 지식인 are positions from which the hidden laws guiding the vested interests that prevent periodic popular eruptions of democratic ferment, to make government structurally more responsive to the demands of direct democracy can be laid to view. Neither knave nor fool, Jung the PresidentElect is a rogue who is an intellectual even though he has had no education, and it opens up a subject position from which to combat cynical reason. I have translated Jung as a rogue or bastard because the first character, chap, which means in Sino-Korean a mixed variety, suggests impure lineage, which is the worst thing to be in Korea. To be without jokbo, family genealogy is the worst thing. It is, however, an essential mode of being in the digital age. The ability to combine and integrate rather than distill and purify is a facility that Kim Il-jung prizes in making content spreadable. And Jamnom is someone who can perform this function extraordinarily. 지식인 also has a specifically digital valence of meaning as it refers in the Korean context extremely popular functionality on the Korean search engine Naver, Korea's most widely used internet portal, to post questions and get answers. Ask 지식인 for Koreans under the age of 40 would not mean ask your professor, but post a question on Naver. Understood this way, 지식인 is a medium of enabling and achieving collective intelligence rather than a single extraordinary person who is an authoritative repository of knowledge. Indeed, collective intelligence, crowdfunding, and fan-based prosumerism have been integral to Nakhin Soo and Darth Vader's success. And the recent launch of Flower company dedicated to political polling has also been made possible by user subscriptions. In response to Kim Il-jung's declaration, never will we be gaslit again by political polls designed to support the conservative agenda, Kim Il-jung started actually a polling company of his own. And when he did, his support base, indeed his fandom, showed up. The fandom that the Maverick Newsman had built over the 3 decades of searching for an alternate messaging system responded to his call by opening their wallets and pocketbooks. So let me conclude. What might South Korea's democracy after post-democratization look like going forward? Whether the new left's call to end the 87 regime through the dual reform of the press and the prosecution succeeds in the next session of the National Assembly in Korea, and I hope it does. And whether thereby the democratic right of every Korean individual to have their interest represented in the political process is expanded and deepened, whether that happens or not, I still think that one thing is clear. Kim Il-jung's position of the bastard with no birthright, the intellectual with no education, and now 공장장, the manager of a news factory, his new moniker, is informed by the ever naive but ever hopeful kinetic faith in the power of the collective intelligence of the people, especially a people that is now the most and highest educated in the world, the most connected in the world, the most digitalized and tech-savvy in the world. When awakened and vigilant, their organized power is the last safeguard for democracy. And here I'm quoting the famous words of the former president, Moon Hyun, the high school grad lawyer against whom the Joseonilbo waged a vicious and sustained war that was successful in the short run, but maybe not so successful in the long run. To this people, the South Korean people in the 21st century, it is the job of the 잠놈 지식인 with 무학의 통찰 to declare, following Sima Chen, the grand historian, wagging tongues, will